Chapter 47, Conservation Biology and Biodiversity, will be our final chapter in this second semester of Introductory Biology. Now, in this chapter, we're going to talk about biodiversity, and as a definition, the term biodiversity means the number, the actual count, and the kinds or the varieties of species and their abundance in a given location on the planet. So there are some additional measurements besides just counting and noting what kinds of species there are, but we can take a measure of their genetic diversity, and all three of these things will feed into the importance of whether or not we maintain the number and kinds of species. Genetic diversity is their potential for adapting to their environment and hence survival, and it's linked to what is actually in their genes. So by this I mean that the greater the genetic variability, the greater the chance that a species has to adapt to changes which may come across that particular species and allow for its survival. Chemical diversity. So by here we use the term chemical, and I am talking primarily about proteins that are made by cells of various species, and these chemicals can benefit the survival of the species, but they can also potentially benefit humans depending on what the product is and if it could be used in an economic way or in a medical way to benefit humans. And then lastly, ecosystem diversity. So here we are talking about the fact that across the planet we have a variety of different ecosystems, and the loss of ecosystems could potentially have a great impact on diversity, causing a subsequent loss in diversity. For example, we have seen over the last 100 years a dramatic decrease in the prairie ecosystem in the middle of the United States, and this has been replaced by agricultural or crop fields. Additionally, the loss of coral reefs in Australia due to climate change. So these are losses of ecosystems, and anytime you remove an ecosystem, you're going to decrease biodiversity. So let's look at how we name, describe, and actually predict how many species that there are on the planet. Scientists are working arduously to identify and catalog all these organisms, but it is a challenging effort. So we currently have names for about 1.5 million eukaryotic species, but we believe this really is only 20% of the total number of species that are out there. So we think there's somewhere around 9 million species that are actually on the earth currently, and yet we only know the names for 1.5 million of them. And so diversity is so great, which is a good thing, that if we proceeded at our current rate of naming and describing species, it would take more than 500 years to actually complete all of the identifications of species. So given this information, it's clear that we'll never have a completely accurate number of species, and therefore a completely accurate measurement of biodiversity. But one thing that we do know is that with the named species we know and through various studies, we are seeing changes in the biodiversity on the planet. So here's a chart from the chapter, which is looking at 3 studies, one in 2022, one in 2009, and one in 2011, looking at the described number of species across various types of living organisms and how many we predict that we actually know. So you can see that these numbers really, really vary. even between studies roughly a decade apart. So we do have to be concerned about how many species are really out there and how many we think are really out there. Now, the internet and technology are tools that have made the job of counting and naming species easier, but it's still challenging with increasing extinction rates. So now let's take a look at biodiversity across the terrestrial map. And here we see a flat view of the continents as they're currently laid out. And we can see, based on colors, a biodiversity of amphibian species across the globe. So if we take a look at this, and anywhere we see purple, there's very few. And anywhere we see a darker orange, then we are seeing the highest numbers, and there's a range in between. So you can see that at roughly the equator for amphibians is where we see the greatest number of biodiversity, particularly in amphibians, but this holds true for other groups of living things. And then as we move into northern or southern latitudes, we see those numbers drop off considerably as we go away from the equator. So why do we have this increasing of biodiversity in the tropic regions around the equator? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, the tropical ecosystems are older than some of these other ecosystems, particularly the ones heading north, because, and heading further south too in the opposite direction toward the poles, because it was harder for these ecosystems to get established in colder climates. And so these tropical ecosystems had a longer time to actually get established. Now, these tropical ecosystems also have a higher number of niches. And remember, a niche is a sort of a slot which a particular species can occupy, where they utilize the resources and the habitat of that particular area to their benefit. And if you remember back to the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species can occupy exactly the same niche within a given area. So the fact that there are far many more niches in the tropical regions gives organisms a better chance at finding their own niche, their own special spot in which to flourish. And thirdly, the tropical climate is much more stable. Not that they don't have seasonality, because there are fluctuations in seasons, but they're far much less variable than we see in the climates as we go into upper and lower latitudes. Now, across time, we have noticed more recently that there are certain spots or regions where they are at higher risk for the loss of biodiversity. And these coincide with regions with lots and lots of endemic species. Remember, an endemic species is highly adapted to a particular region and doesn't really want to live anywhere else. So we have currently 34 hotspots. So those are the ones that are in red. 34 hotspots that are designated as regions which are very likely to experience a high loss of biodiversity. Now, these hotspots cover only 2.3% of the total Earth's surface, which is a small amount. But if we look at them, they have endemic species within them, terrestrial vertebrates and plants that are at a very high level. For example, in any one of these areas, 42% of their terrestrial vertebrate species and 50% of their plants are at risk of a loss of biodiversity. So these are really fragile areas on the planet. and they're areas that we need to take a closer look at if we want to maintain biodiversity across the globe. So now loss of species, and great loss of species, has occurred, and so the question is, has biodiversity had dramatic change before? So that answer is yes. And so remember back when we've looked at mass extinction events, there are 5 previous mass extinction events over the last 500 million years. And we have noted during these times that there has been tremendous loss of species, therefore loss of biodiversity in Earth's history. So this is not a new event. What is new is that over these events, here's our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 events, these events have primarily been caused by natural occurrences, increases in volcanic activity, the arrival of asteroids or meteorites, or sometimes the two together, which have led to a large global climate change and a subsequent loss of biodiversity. The largest loss being in the end Permian, or what we called the Great Dying, about 250 million years ago. And then the second largest here at the end Cretaceous, where we saw the loss of the dinosaurs. So these are major extinction events where we saw lots of loss of biodiversity, but they have all been at the cause of some natural event. So now in current day, we are entering or are presently in the 6th mass extinction event during the Holocene era, which we are currently in. Now this event, as we've looked at before, is primarily due to human activities. This is things we have done to the planet. We are not seeing extensive increase in natural volcanic activity, although volcanoes still erupt, but it's not massive. We are not seeing currently an asteroid or a meteor that has hit the planet. But what we are seeing is that due to human activities, massive habitat destruction, overhunting, and pollution causing a large loss in biodiversity. So I mentioned habitat loss first in the last slide, and the reason that I've shown that is that studies have indicated that habitat is incredibly crucial to a species' need to grow in numbers, so that when we see habitat levels increasing, like we see in this graph, when we can increase the habitat available to species, we see an increase in the number of species that can inhabit that region. So the size of a habitat is directly related to the number of species in any given relationship. So therefore, if we are decreasing the habitat, making it smaller, we are going to be decreasing the number of species that will live in that area. And this is what humans are doing. They are causing massive habitat loss. So now let's take a look at biodiversity impacts on humans. So if species are declining, and they are, why do we care? Why do humans care about the loss of other species? Well, biodiversity can really impact human health. There are many plant compounds that work as medications. So having these plants available as a source of the medication is really crucial. Also, there's many species out there, plant species, that we don't know about that could yield a very crucial drug to the treatment of currently diseases or illnesses that impact humans. For example, we found out in the 1970s that tamoxifen, which is a plant product, was a huge treatment could be a huge treatment in breast cancer after surgery and potential chemotherapy. A patient could go on to tamoxifen to help them if their breast cancer was estrogen related. Additionally, there are chemicals that we can get from animals, such as venoms and poisons, that are actually, again, used as medications. There's heart medications which come from these kinds of animal-derived products. So if biodiversity decreases, then these sources are reduced and we are impacted. We as humans rely on agriculture to make the food that we need to support our ever-growing population. So crop diversity is essential for disease resistance. If we decrease our crop diversity, if we cut down and don't make as many crops, then disease resistance goes it's harder for these plants to resist disease if their genetic variability is restricted. So seed manufacturers rely on wild species to increase diversity. They breed back our crop plants to wild plants to try to build back in some diversity. So we need to have those wild plants available in order to keep our crop diversity in a healthy state. Also, the following leads to less productive food manufacture. Loss of pollinators. We're seeing a dramatic loss of bees and other insects that allow for pollination, and crops require that a lot of these insects travel from one plant to another in order to make fertilize the plants and allow for seed production and food production. And we're not really clear as to why this is happening, but the loss of these animal species can impact the loss of our crop production. Also, a heavy use of pesticides can cause a reduction in crops and therefore food production, and over farming can reduce the quality of the soil. So if we continue to plant the same crops in the same fields year after year, we are reducing biodiversity in the soil and we are impacting the crops that we can produce. Here is one effort to maintain biodiversity from the aspect of saving seeds. So this is a seed vault in the Arctic of Norway in which we have placed many hybrid and as well as original seed species, so that should there be a global collapse of world agriculture, we will be able to go back into this seed vault, bring these seeds out, and repopulate the crops that humans need to exist and to rebuild world agriculture. So this is a very important effort in case there is ever a massive loss of agricultural crops across the planet. Other biodiversity impacts on humans include loss of wild food sources. This we see a lot with fish. So overfishing has resulted over the last couple hundred years in the extinction of some species or the dramatic loss of some numbers of some species, such that it is almost impossible to get these particular species in the markets that we are used to seeing. Additionally, hunting for sport is something that humans like to do, and if we hunt for sport to the point that we put the sport animals at a level that they are approaching extinction, then we no longer have that activity available for humans. So if biodiversity decreases again in these wild animals, then these will not be available for human use. And lastly, psychological and moral impact. So humans spending time in nature benefits our well-being. So it's important for humans to spend time in natural environments. It really, brings us back to our roots, so to speak. And so this is a very important psychological aspect, and it helps us to remember that we are just one species on this planet, and there's many others. Additionally, something that has built from an economic standpoint is ecotourism. So there are countries and individual businesses that have built their economic model on bringing people in to experience nature, and this is something they need to continue their business. So a loss of biodiversity will really impact and negatively impact this business. So what are some of the threats to biodiversity? As I mentioned, the number one threat is habitat loss. Number one, and it occurs across the globe. It's not just in one particular location. So increases in human population has led to destroying natural habitat, that we have taken this habitat away from natural species to build our homes and grow our crops. And this is not just terrestrial land, but rather this occurs when we dam rivers or we drain lakes or when we dredge rivers to build shipping lanes. So we are decreasing habitats in all of the types of ecosystems. Now, secondarily, we have over-harvesting. So this is taking too many of the species, particularly acute or problematic in fisheries. So remember, many fisheries are international. Nobody owns these ocean waters. So there's little motivation to preserve or conserve the species that are there. And this leads to overfishing, because from an economic standpoint, people want to maintain their businesses and they don't want to be told when and where they can fish. Also, technology has led to overfishing. There are very sophisticated boats and mechanisms that can collect up fish, and it's not only the fish that they are particularly suited to catch, but it also traps other organisms like marine mammals that get caught in these fishing nets. And so this has led to a dramatic loss in marine mammals, including whales. And it takes a very long time for these animals to recover due to their long reproductive cycles. Now, hunting endangered and threatened species is another aspect. And this occurs particularly for exotic species on the African and Asian continents. Large mammals like elephants and tigers have been hunted as trophy species, or also to collect various components of their bodies like the ivory in elephants to use and sell. Now, exotic and invasive species, I'll talk more about in the upcoming slides, but exotic species, when they are introduced in an area that is not their native species, can outcompete or bring demise to endemic species, causing disease, etc. They can also directly affect humans. For example, the European star thistle is a plant species that is invasive and was brought in, and it causes the U.S. cropland to be less productive. Another plant species, the giant hogweed, as well as several invasive ticks, are also extremely dangerous, can cause health problems for humans. And lastly, of course, climate change. So causing global climate change is another threat to biodiversity, and I'll talk more about that in subsequent slides. So here's an example of an exotic invasive species which has caused increased predation on its introduced land. This is an example of the brown tree snake, which was brought into the island of Guam quite accidentally. So these species could be brought in by mistake, or they could be introduced on purpose to try to fix a problem. Like in Australia, there were species brought in to try to eradicate other species, and then they've taken over. But this brown tree snake snuck into Guam on an airplane, and since the 1950s, it's caused the extinction of 3 endemic, remember those are the species that can only live there, endemic birds, and 3 to 5 species of reptiles, which are only found on Guam. Another example of an invasive species is a fungus. So there was a fungus that was brought in from Europe into the United States, and it started impacting white-nosed bats, little brown bats in the East Coast, and not so long ago, in 2009, and it causes what is labeled the white nose syndrome. You see that this poor little brown bat has fungus, white fungus growing on its nose. It causes these bats to be very sick and die, and it has brought these bat species to near extinction, and is moving into other bat species throughout the United States. Now remember, bats are very important because they consume lots and lots of insects. They help keep our insect population down, and some of them actually act as pollinators as well. So to lose the bats, some people may say, well, I don't care about bats, but to lose the bats from the ecosystem could cause a dramatic increase in insect populations. And then the next thing was the climate change. So we do know that climate is increasing. That is a fact, and that is because of fossil fuel burning and other human impacts which have caused a slow, steady alteration in average temperatures, and this has resulted in change in precipitation patterns. That's climate change. That's not weather change. That is over long term. And this climate change results in significant habitat change. With this, animal populations move. When they move and they interact, they can result in a change in biodiversity. So here we see a map of Northern America, the United States, which was primarily the habitat of the grizzly bear historically, this sort of a brown color. And here up near the Arctic and into the upper reaches of Canada, we see the normal habitat of the polar bear. These two species did not interact. There was a blockage, a geographical separation between the two species. They never met, so they never ever interacted or possibly interbred. Now, all of a sudden, because of climate change, temperatures have warmed and the grizzly bears have started to move into this region, and that's the tan region, and they've actually overlapped with the polar bear region, and we have noted some interbreeding between polar bears and grizzly bears. So now we have a growler bear. This is the first instance of this wild hybrid ever been found. And what this will do to the polar bear population is unknown. It could be, remember, two species can't exist in the same niche. And so what will this do to these two species? Measuring biodiversity and threats is very important to understand which groups are most impacted. So if we take a look at this graph, we see the percentage of species that are critically endangered, near extinction, moderately endangered, approaching extinction, or vulnerable, threatened. So we see that for various groups of animals and plants, the various relationships. So therefore, the more red, the worst, but the more of all three is the ultimate danger for a group of organisms. And here in this graph, we see the most endangered are the amphibians. They are very susceptible because they have a very limited habitat in which they can survive. So what can we do? What can we do to help the issue of biodiversity? Well, there are some things we can do legally. So, for example, in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was put into law. This is only in the United States. It is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has programs which protect and reestablished endangered and threatened species, and it's been quite successful in certain species, and we have seen species brought back from the brink of extinction. And so this has been a very successful piece of legislation, but it's limited because it's only in the United States. When we move to globally, we have other initiatives like the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. That was in 1975. This was a global initiative to have countries agree that they will not sell or trade products from endangered species. But countries can agree to this and countries cannot agree to this, or they may agree and still within, they may not put into place laws that penalize individuals that do these activities. So there's limits when we try to do things globally. Also, what can we do on a more local level? We can restore habitat. We can set aside lands and build national parks on which areas are either brought back into their natural habitat, or they're currently in their natural habitat, and we say, okay, we're not going to change this, so that therefore we can hopefully reduce losses of biodiversity. We can also, on the aquatic side, remove dams, stop the draining of lakes, etc., to try to preserve aquatic habitats. Also, we can initiate captive breeding programs. There's many wildlife organizations which plan to raise and then release endangered species. This helped the California condor reestablish. This bird was almost extinct, and through captive breeding programs and release of birds back into the wild, they are now a healthy species again. Also, zoos, although they have captive breeding programs, but they don't release their animals, they can raise awareness and education for people to realize how important these initiatives are, and to hopefully get them to support habitat restoration, captive breeding programs, and get them to support legislation both locally and globally that will protect and preserve biodiversity. And that concludes our chapter.